Number 10. Noir. In Marvel's Noirverse of Earth 90214, the X-Men are actually troubled youth and delinquents who are brought together by Charles Xavier, a controversial psychiatrist who believed that sociopathy was the next state of human evolution. Instead of attempting to redeem the youth whom he took into his school, the Xavier School for Exceptionally Wayward Youth, he worked to train them even further in their criminal arts. While some of them were exceptionally dangerous, at the end of the day, this version of the X-Men were just young criminals who were humans. So yeah, but they did have guns, so there is that. Number 9. 1602. The X-Men of Earth 311 are surprisingly powerful for the time period in which they live, 1602. In this reality, mutants are instead called Witchbreed, and the team of X-Men are an Elizabethan reflection of the Earth 616 original team. Carlos Xavier is their teacher and head, while Scotius Summerisle is their leader and is joined by the ice-wielding Robert Trefusis, a beast like Henry McCoy, and the powerful telekinetic and telepath disguised as a boy, Jean Grey. Together, this team managed to help save their reality when a rift was caused due to all these heroes basically coming into existence so early, destabilizing it. In the end, Jean died from overuse of her powers, making her weaker than her 616 counterpart, but overall, the team is still pretty strong, especially for this time period, like I said. And friends, before we move on to our next spot, if you are loving this list and you want more lists like it, I don't know if there's 10 more alternate versions of the X-Men, but we can definitely do something in this realm. Be sure to let us know by giving this video a thumbs up. And also, go check out our Top 10 Nerd Elite, our new channel, and make sure you subscribe to that where we're gonna have lots of bonus content for you. Number 8. Earth Z. The X-Men were some of the last heroes standing up against the zombie horde on Earth 2149, or Earth Z. While Professor X was quickly devoured, Magneto stepped in to become the leader and encouraged the X-Men to fight to kill their opponents, as opposed to just, trying to hold them off. Otherwise, he warned the heroes would easily be overcome. Gone were the days of fighting to incapacitate their enemies. Wolverine himself seemed very much on board with this, and when Nick Fury called a meeting of the surviving heroes to explain the situation on the S.H.I.E.L.D. helicarrier, many of the X-Men could be spotted amongst their numbers. Surviving in Marvel Zombies even just for that initial wave is pretty impressive, considering how many iconic and powerful heroes didn't make it. In fact, when they're with Nick Fury, I'm pretty sure I counted 9 of them, which I think is pretty impressive. Number 7. Days of Future Past. The X-Men team from Earth 811 didn't do too hot, and ultimately ended up trapped in a post-apocalyptic situation where the world was ending and Sentinels were killing just about everything. Although they ultimately failed in their attempt to travel to the past to fix it to save the future, with Rachel Summers transporting Kitty Pryde back in time to the body of her younger self, Kitty still found a way to save the day when she returned as Widget, and with help from an alternate Excalibur team and alternate Rachel Summers, deprogrammed the Sentinels, turning them into Protectrons of a sort who would work to defend the mutants instead of destroy them. Basically, I feel like Days of Future Past is just powerful because of Kitty, but that's just my opinion. Anyways, Kitty's pretty powerful, Kitty and Rachel, so that's all we really need. Number 6. Ultimates, or Ultimates, if you will. Earth 1610. In the ultimate reality, the X-Men were born out of a break between Professor Charles Xavier and Magneto's Eric Lehnsherr. Here, the two were friends and like-minded individuals for a time who together founded the Brotherhood of Mutants. They lived together with their students in peace and harmony on the Savage Land, until a falling out drove them apart, due to Magneto believing in ruling humankind and Xavier disagreeing with that. Magneto was the one responsible for Professor X losing his ability to walk and ending up in a wheelchair, and Professor X ended up creating his own mutant group called the X-Men. Later, during the X-Men's fight against Magneto during Ultimatum, many members of the team died, but a few of the most powerful did manage to survive. The team members that survived included Jean Grey, Kitty Pryde, Colossus, Rogue, Iceman, and Storm. And I think that was pretty much it, actually. Ugh. Number 5. The Brotherhood of Evil X-Men from the Future. So this team isn't really a straight up alternate X-Men team, as the name implies. I'm cheating just a little bit here. However, they did pose as the true future X-Men when they showed up in Battle of the Atom, and I really like them, so I'm just gonna count them, cause I do the lists, so I get to decide what folks we include. Cool? Cool. This team also has some of my favorite overall members, with Charles Xavier II appearing as the leader, and also boasting of a roster including and formerly including Zorn, Jean Grey, an Ice Hulk version of Bobby Drake, an insane version of Beast, Raze, Deadpool, and a much more powerful Molly Hayes, who doesn't succumb to exhaustion after using her super strength. Which is pretty scary, because Molly Hayes is pretty strong. Number 4. The Dark X-Men. The Dark X-Men is Norman Osborn's team of mutants who were brought together in response to unrest in the mutant community during the events of Dark Reign. Honestly, I feel like between number 5 on this list and number 4, it really could have gone either way, so let me know if you feel like, the future fake X-Men should have gone above, because I was very on the fence about this. Initially, Norman Osborn was not allowed to get involved with the mutants, but after riots broke out, he was able to finally make his own X-Men team, which he declared to the public was the real X-Men team, declaring the real X-Men team outlaws. Fortunately, it turned out both the team leader Emma Frost and Namor the Submariner, who, when pitted against the true X-Men, turned on their own dark X-Men teammates. I didn't even talk about the other people on this roster, but there were lots of cool people. Number 3. Extreme X-Men. Extreme X-Men Volume 2 is an X-Men series and a team that takes a page out of the Exiles book, not to be confused with Chris Claremont's Extreme X-Men roster led by Storm in Volume 1 of that series. This version, written by Greg Pak, is a multiversal team of heroes who hail from various alternate realities. Seriously, I love this series. It's 1, really pretty, and 2, it's just really cool. The team is typically led by the main continuity Dazzler, Allison Blair. The team roster included such amazing members as Sage, Earth 12025 Hercules, boyfriend of the James Howlett of that reality, the James Howlett from Earth 12025 himself, Emmeline Frost Summers, an OP godlike immortal version of Emma Frost who is married to Scott in her reality of Earth 52012, Corporal Scott Summers from the American Civil War reality of Earth 70213, a younger version of Kurt nicknamed Kid Nightcrawler, and a floating Xavier head. So many great people. Number 2. Age of Apocalypse. I would say the Age of Apocalypse version of the X-Men has to be one of the toughest versions out there, which shouldn't come as a surprise as, like eventually happened on Earth Z, Magneto also kinda ended up becoming their leader after the death of Xavier. Although in the Age of Apocalypse reality of Earth 295, many things are different. Rogue and Magneto end up getting kinda married, with another kind of odd relationship developing between Storm and Quicksilver that also kinda makes sense given this reality, and Cyclops ends up working for Apocalypse, who rules the world. Another major difference is that in this reality, Charles was actually killed before he could ever form the X-Men, meaning that Magneto was their one true leader here. Number 1. Future X-Men. Personally, I think the future X-Men that we meet in Battle of the Atom, the real future X-Men of Earth 13729 that is, are pretty nuts. I mean, they have Widget on their team. Widget! And they also have a wizard version of Iceman who goes by the name Ice Wizard now, and Wiccan as one of their members as well. I don't know about you, but it doesn't really sound like it gets better than that. Jubilee also takes up the mantle of Wolverine in this reality, which is adorable, and Logan goes on to become the new professor, being known as Professor Logan, which I love. Number 10. Deadly Genesis. We can talk about different X-Men and mutant teams here, but I'd also like to touch on some of the rosters as well that you may have forgotten about. This one might be due to selective memory loss, or it could just be because you haven't read the story yet. We are talking here about the X-Men Deadly Genesis limited series, which revealed the next team sent into Krakoa after the X-Men team we know went missing. This team wasn't necessarily a bad one at all. In fact, all of these mutants are kinda super powerful, but they were all basically introduced in this short series, which didn't really help to make us care as much about them as we could have. All in all, this story just had a very early 2000s feel to it. Not that that's a bad thing. The Deadly Genesis X-Men team were a group of kids that Moira McTaggart was trying to help out. She didn't even really see them as students, and then Charles recruited them and turned them into X-Men. The team consisted of Sway, Petra, Vulcan, and Darwin, who have all recently reappeared in the Dawn of X line, in case you were wondering where they made their first appearance. Number 9. Xavier's Security Enforcers. One that we might forget about every now and then is the mutant team that Bishop originally belonged to from the alternate dystopian future that he hails from. I believe this Earth is 1191, but I could be mistaken on that. Didn't even write down my Earth number. Bothers me. This mutant team is known as the XSE, which stands for Xavier's Security Enforcers. If you know Bishop well and you're a big fan, you likely know this team well, but for those who are new to the character, you might not know about this group of enforcers. The point of the team that Bishop was part of was to preserve the long-dead Professor Charles Xavier's dream, where mutants and humans could exist in harmony, living peacefully together. Bishop has even been known to wield specific future equipment, which he got from XSE, although we haven't seen them in a while. All members of the team wear their mutant tattoo brands like a badge of honor, and the members have included Randall, Malcolm, and Bishop's sister Shard, among others over the years. Before we hop into our number 8 spot, I just want to thank all of you for being here and give you a quick reminder to click that like if you are enjoying this video. It really does help us out. Number 8. Nasty Boys. You might remember the original villainous Marauders team, but do you remember Mr. Sinister's Nasty Boys? Don't worry if you have, because I will never let you forget. While both the Marauders and Nasty Boys teams are villainous teams, I couldn't have an obscure mutant team list and not seize the opportunity to remind you all of the Nasty Boys. So here we are. I also just love this name for the team. I personally always read Mr. Sinister with like the most outlandish, flamboyant, yet manipulative pseudo-English accent. So for me, it's very fitting that he decided to name his team this. Nasty Boys, so perfect. It fits perfectly with the voice that I have for him in my mind. The Nasty Boys were the team that came after the Marauders. Instead of Gambit being involved in the team, Multiple Man was the generally heroic mutant who got involved. Originally, the team saw Ruckus as leader, with Slab, Gorgeous George, Ramrod, and Hairbag making up the roster. Gorgeous George even resurfaced in Dawn of X more recently. Yay! I might be the only one, but I'm still kinda hoping that the Nasty Boys as well will make a return. Bring them back. Bring them back. Number 7. Outback. When it comes to X-Men rosters as teams, one of the best but shortest running roster is the Outback team. This era for the X-Men team lasted less than 25 issues, but was still so good that people still talk about it today. Now if you missed this one and you've never heard of it, it's one that you actually probably should read. Not one of my silly points, more one of my serious and beloved forgotten teams on this list. The team started off in issue 229 of Uncanny X-Men, with Storm, Wolverine, Rogue, Colossus, Dazzler, Longshot, Havoc, and Psylocke on it. We'd also see Jubilee introduced during this roster's time together. The Outback team is noted as being one of the best rosters for the X-Men when it comes to having a group who truly feel like outsiders. Also, you get to enjoy the Inferno story in this run, which is bizarre and magical, so you're welcome for that. Number 6. X-Corp. No, I'm not talking about the X Corporation, which has yet to come out but is still coming our way. Thank goodness. I thought that book was going to be firmly cancelled, but fortunately it has been revived. I'm so ready for X Corporation, let's go. When we talk about X-Corp, we are talking about Banshee's team. He formed this team after Generation X disbanded, and most of the team were composed of that era of mutants. This team was made up of former villains turned heroes and was created to act as a police force basically for the mutant community. Joining Banshee were the Blob, Avalanche, Fever Pitch, Jubilee, Husk, and M, aka Monet. The X-Men team actually did not approve of this team's creation and actually attempted to get Banshee to disband it. In the end, Mystique infiltrated the team and liberated its members, especially the villains, who were being manipulated into behaving heroically by Mastermind under Banshee's orders. Number 5. Extreme X-Men. This X-Men roster marked the return of Chris Claremont to the X-Men in a full-time capacity. Extreme X-Men Volume 1 is a series that started in 2001 and ran till 2004. It was a team that featured my girl Rogue as the leader, woohoo, which you know I'm all about. The original Extreme X-Men roster also featured Beast, Psylocke, Bishop, Storm, Sage, and Thunderbird on the team. Lifeguard, Gambit, and Slipstream were also added to the mix throughout. This team was originally brought together to find Destiny's premonition-filled diaries, but of course along the way was distracted by many other imminent threats. As you do when you're on an X team. Number 4. Generation Hope. This one is from the 2010 series Generation Hope and was under Cyclops' banner ultimately following the events of Regenesis. Though the team itself was led by mutant messiah Hope Summers, and its roster consisted of No Girl, Pixie, Primal, Sebastian Shaw, Transonic, Velocidad, and Zero at that time. Though originally Hope's team started pre-Regenesis as just being 5 mutants including Hope herself, with Velocidad, Oya, Primal, and Transonic on the team. The team was a search and rescue group who were brought together as they were acknowledged as being 4 of the 5 lights on Cerebra. Hope basically triggered the rebirth of the mutant gene, activating these mutants. The 5th light was what they sought and kinda why they came together, heading to Tokyo, Japan. Zero was the mutant they sought, who would eventually join the team. although originally would be antagonist. Number 3. X-People. You probably forgot about this team just because their name is, well, super forgettable, but they are actually from a very memorable alternate universe, the MC2, or also known as Alternate Earth 982. This Earth is the home of the beloved Mayday Parker, aka Spider-Girl, now known as Spider-Woman. But you know what's not so memorable from that universe? Their version of the X-Men. I mean, I get that X-People is meant to be gender neutral, more inclusive, but is that really the best name they could come up with? There has to be something that isn't X-Men that is better than that. I mean, I know there is because we have dozens of other X teams with the letter X in them that are way more catchy than X-People. Because of the Earth it is set in, X-People is a team of originally younger mutants who are now older and taking on the role of leaders, mentors, and teachers. Actually, here Jubilee is the team leader, with her core team roster including Simeon, Angry Eagle, Torque, and Spanner. Number 2. Factor 3. Factor 3? That sounds like some kind of toothpaste. This is another villainous team composed of mutants but led by an alien known as Mutant Master. You might not remember it because it was only around for a few issues and also first appeared way early on in X-Men issue 28 back in 1967. This team popped up a few times and would often force mutants into doing their bidding, often mind-controlling Banshee to attempt to kidnap or help kidnap Professor X. What a wacky time it was. Fortunately, in issue 39, Factor 3 was defeated for good and hasn't bothered the X-Men since. So we haven't seen them for a really long time. Number 1. Lightning Force. This X-Men team comes to us admittedly from an alternate reality, which might be why you've never heard of it before. But once you learn about them, you'll likely wish they had remained forgotten. Lightning Force is an X-Men team that we come across in the Exiles, who themselves belong to Earth 597. They are basically the alternate Excalibur team from their reality, a reality where the Axis won World War II. I think you know where we're going with this. Their roster is almost as surprising as the whole idea for this team. We have Herr Xavier, who helped to create the team through experimenting on them. Yikes. And leading the team we have Hauptmann England, aka Captain Britain, with Magon, aka Gloriana, Shadowcat, and Nightcrawler. Also, if you were wondering, yes, Kitty Pryde is still Jewish in this reality, which yeah, makes her character's history here pretty dark. Number 10. All-Female X-Men. Oddly enough, this book didn't do as hot as expected despite the fact that it was an awesome powerhouse team composed of all ladies. This team was first introduced in 2013's X-Men series in issue number 1 as one of the main X-Men teams, and the series was part of the Marvel Now event. The team featured Kitty Pryde, Rogue, Rachel Summers, Jubilee, and Psylocke, with Storm as the leader. This team was the first in the history of the X-Men to be an all-female team with its own book. So while it was not a commercial success, it's still an important part of X-Men history to be noted for sure. Number 9. Chuck Austin's Uncanny X-Men. At least I kind of hope you've never heard of this one, because if you have, you probably just forgot about it after years of trying, and now I'm traumatizing you by bringing it back up. This is the team that featured Stacy X. Yeah. I like Stacy X, but I can also see why her character and this run were super problematic. Austin's run on Uncanny X-Men began in issue 410 and ran till issue 443. The problem here wasn't so much to do with the members of the team as the subject matter. Many people feel that Austin's run was hypersexual, and he also gave us the revelation that Nightcrawler's dad was Azazel, which honestly isn't that terrible, but then he also gave us the weird Draco storyline with the X-Men versus the Neopham, which was something. It was a time. All in, this was definitely a controversial run, especially considering the relationship between Husk and Angel. The team was made up of Archangel, Beast, Iceman, Nightcrawler, Stacy X, Wolverine, and Professor X himself to start, but it would later on feature Husk, Polaris, Northstar, Juggernaut, and Havoc. Before we move on to this next spot, just a quick little reminder to click that like button if you haven't already, it really does help us out. Number 8. Children of the Atom. You might not have heard of this one because it isn't even out yet, but this is one of the new teams and books that we had expected to see earlier this year, but due to the global pandemic was delayed and is now delayed again. Originally it was moved to January of 2021, but now we aren't expected to see it till April of 2021. boy, that is a long wait. But just because they aren't around yet doesn't mean we can't talk about them. And if you haven't heard of this team yet, you might want to keep your eye out for when their book is released. Children of the Atom is a team of new teen mutants who are basically X-Men superfans and are trained by these very famous original mutants. Technically, the X-Men team was never meant to exist in Krakoa, as was just revealed recently in the comics, despite them having their own book as part of the Dawn of X line. I know, it's a little confusing. So it'll be interesting to see how the Children of the Atom, who are being advertised as kind of X-Men sidekicks, fit in exactly. In a world where, you know, there's not really supposed to be X-Men? Well, we have yet to meet the members of this team. We do know some of them not only have similar costumes to the classic X-Men, but also have similar powers. Number 7. Hellions. No, not that Hellions. This Hellions. In fact, Empath's look in the new Hellions was a throwback to the original Hellions team outfits. Empath was also an original member of the team. Before we saw the team revived in Dawn of X, they were Emma Frost's team. Basically her version of a teenage mutant team similar to, well, the New Mutants. We're also a Teenage Mutant team. Every time I say Teenage Mutant team, I just want to say Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, but that's not what we're talking about. Although they are also a Teenage Mutant team. In comparison to the new Hellions, these Hellions were not as crazy, but were somewhat troublemakers, who had an ongoing, sometimes friendly rivalry with the New Mutants themselves. The team consisted of Empath, Beef, Bevatron, Cat's Eye, Roulette, Taro, Thunderbird, Jetstream, and Firestart. The team was first introduced in New Mutants issue number 16 in the 1980s and was disbanded in 2009 in the comics after most of them were basically slaughtered, victims of a surprise attack. The team has returned since, but the new Hellions team only shares one member of the original roster, Empath. Number 6. X Corporation. Many people may have forgotten the existence of X Corporation since the organization was destroyed and became defunct back in the early 2000s, but they are coming back, so it's a pretty good time to remind everyone of their existence. Reminder, X Corp is still a thing. This actually just happened in the comics during the Empire event when we saw for certain that Xavier had revived the X Corp and that Monet and Angel seem to be running this branch of mutant affairs. X Corp in the past has been a non-for-profit organization working to help mutants in their fight for rights in less bold ways than what the X-Men are usually up to. It also provided a place of refuge for mutants who needed it, until the global organization had their various branches targeted and blown up around the globe following the events of M-Day. X Corp will be getting their own book in the Dawn of X line, which I am way too excited about. I just want to see Angel get a moment in the spotlight, you know? Many believe the book to have been cancelled, but Jonathan Hickman actually confirmed early in December that it is still very much a go. Number 5. X-Men The End. In this series we saw a bunch of teams kind of come together, ending in one big one, and Chris Claremont's The End. I like this X-Men team as well because although she died pretty early on in terms of her appearance here, we also get a shout out at least to Dust. And Dust is such an underrated X-Men in my opinion. This comic also introduces us to the future daughter of Bishop and Deathbird, Aaliyah Bishop. The final X-Men team features Kitty Pryde, Wolfsbane, Karma, North Star, Dust, Martha Johansson aka No Girl, the Cuckoos, Cyclops, and a subgroup known as the Heavy Hitters, which features Wither, Frenzy, Polaris, Juggernaut, and Kid Colossus. Number 4. The Upstarts. Speaking of young mutant teams that are lesser known like the Hellions, we also have their straight up not friendly at all rivals, the Upstarts. The Upstarts were definitely a more villainous crew in comparison to the Hellions, just in general, as their whole goal was to basically kill mutants. The Upstarts were a mutant team created by Selene, the Black Queen of the Hellfire Club. She put the team together in order to test the members, getting them to compete for points which would be awarded whenever they killed mutants, based on the mutants' power set. Originally, the young group of mutants involved were unnamed and were promised that whoever got the most points would win a prize, which remained a mystery pretty much through all of the comics that they were featured in. I bet it's cake, and I bet it's a lie. Although I think it was also mentioned at one point somewhere that it was immortality, so in case you were wondering, for realsies. Number 3. Battle of the Atom Future X-Men. While everyone might focus on the Battle of the Atom Future Brotherhood team, as Raze has a tendency to steal the show, plus my girl Zorn Jean, and also featuring Molly Hayes, people tend to forget about the awesomeness that was the Future X-Men team. the real X-Men team. This team featured a much more skilled Iceman, who now was known as Ice Wizard, Wiccan, who had become Sorcerer Supreme, Chimera, who is believed to be Storm's daughter that she had with Black Panther, Shogo, Jubilee's son, known as Sentinel X, Colossus armed with Magic Soul Sword, Kid Omega as Phoenix, and Jubilee as Wolverine. Number 2. Extreme Sanctions Executive, the other XSE. This team also spiraled out of the team that we talked about previously on part 1 of this list, Extreme X-Men. XSE here stands for the Extreme Sanctions Executive. Similar to the original XSE that Bishop was a part of in the future, this team is also like a military police force meant to maintain and in some cases enforce peace is kept between mutants and humans. Storm was asked to create the team by the United Nations and eventually would increase its numbers by recruiting the rest of her X-Men, making this team another government-sanctioned mutant team, like X-Factor was, and still one of the first of those types of teams. Team members have included Bishop, Cannonball, Magma, Rachel Summers is on every team, I love it, Psylocke, Rogue, Sage, Wolverine, X-23, and Gambit. Number 1. X-Animals. If you're an intense X-Men fan, you may be familiar with Mojo's X-Babies, but are you familiar with his other attempts at recreating or recasting Marvel's 616 X-Men after they were believed dead? One such team that attempted to step in was the X-Animals. This was a team of, well, animals, who each took on the role of a different mutant member of the X-Men. We've got a skunk standing in for Rogue, a bulldog for Wolverine, a pig for Dazzler, a rabbit as Havoc, a cat for our Storm, which I kinda love, a bird, possibly a hawk as Longshot, an otter as Psylocke, and a gorilla as Colossus. Sadly, this team was not acceptable as a replacement in Mojo's opinion, and he got rid of them. But I'd love to see them return at some point, if that's possible.
Number 10. Bloodstorm. Now Storm is already mistress of the elements, so quite powerful and quite interesting. But what happens when she becomes a vampire? Now this has happened briefly in main continuity, but in the Mutant X universe, it became a permanent change. The Mutant X comic series was published from 1998 to 2001, and as mentioned, it saw a very different Storm. This was after she was bitten by Dracula. Here, she was not saved, but instead became a full-fledged creature of the night. She of course had vows not to kill, so she had the vampire dilemma, which she solved by hiring some of her former teammates to let her drink from them, like Kitty Pryde. She would eventually leave the X-Men and join a team called the Six. She also turns Gambit into a vampire, even though she warns him he'll regret it, and he does. Spoilers. Listen when people warn you. Bloodstorm became a breakout character of this series. Number 9. New Sun Gambit. Speaking of Gambit, let's take a look at one of his alternate versions. This is New Sun Gambit, and he hails from Earth 9921. Gambit actually has enormous power potential that was quashed by Mr. Sinister in the main continuity, but that continuity is not all. In this other universe, he was trained to use his abilities even before he had them, and then when this was combined with his full potential and a mystic ceremony, he became something else altogether. The only thing is, the awakening of all these abilities would create a shockwave that would destroy his Earth, forcing him to travel around, and of course he ended up on the 616 Earth, where he ended up befriending Gambit and trying to help him along his way, but didn't tell him who he was. It was after his reveal and Gambit's subsequent disgust that he changed his name to New Sun. Some fans like seeing the full unleashed potential on display of Gambit. Number 8. Basilisk. Not all alternate versions that people like have happy outcomes. Case in point, Basilisk from Earth 11326, an Earth also known as Age of X. Here, Cyclops was incarcerated in a mutants-only facility after the manifestation of his powers as a teenager killed several people, including his parents. He captured the attention of the prison warden Arcade because of his power set, so he made him this very special mask. It looks a lot like the Skull mask from Persona 5, and it's something that people like about this character. In fact, for many, it's what makes him cooler. It is a very menacing looking mask. Now, a lot of this universe had to do with Legion, one of its personalities, and manifesting another world. So for some, it was just a cool concept in general. The mask looked great. Love the mask. Number 7, Soldier Supreme. Here we have an amalgamated character from Warp World. This was the universe that was created when Gamora had the Infinity Gauntlet, put everybody's souls into the Soul Gem, and then folded that universe in half. As a result of this, the characters were merged and fused together. So you have Marvel characters smushed, and one of those was Captain America, Steve Rogers, and Doctor Strange, Stephen Strange. So I mean, they kind of already had the same name, just spelled differently, so it made it a bit easier. Back there, Dr. Stephen Rogers, but now with a PH. Their stories actually don't fuse too badly. It's World War II, and Stephen Rogers is contracted for a super secret soldier experiment, only it turns out it's a cover for a mystical ceremony instead of for, you know, the scientific one that he actually undergoes. But these mystic rituals still end up enhancing his strength and allowing him to connect with the occult, and he becomes Soldier Supreme. So he has Cap's cowl, but he still has like a mustache. And he was actually one of the heroes who objected to Warp World being completely destroyed at the end of the arc by Adam Warlock. So Warlock found a way to let it still exist and let these characters still exist. It was one of those loopholes. Stephen Rogers did that and kept being a hero. Number 6, Old Man Logan. Would any of our nerd lists be complete without mentioning Old Man Logan? Yes, they would, but it just keeps coming up. It's a staple here on Top 10 Nerd. Well, this story is one of the most popular alternate universe stories out there, and it has a famously gross confrontation between the Hulk and Wolverine, or Logan, because he's not Wolverine anymore in this story. Here we have a grizzled old man Logan fighting his way across a supervillain-controlled America, trying to keep his claws sheathed after what he did, which, spoilers, was somehow managing to kill most of the X-Men. This was because he fell for an illusion created by Mysterio. This is a must-read for many fans and a fave Wolverine story for others. Number 5, X-Apes. The X-Men are monkeys, or rather apes. This, funnily enough, spawned off of the Marvel Zombies universe and event. Basically, they're trying anything. That event was just so popular. This did not turn out to be quite the hit that was, but I mean, few things can. But this universe still has its fans. Actually, everybody in this universe are apes or monkeys or animals of some kind. So really, if you enjoy this concept, it's just the whole universe, and you have people like the Ape Avengers and Dr. Octopus. It's made for a certain type of pun-loving individual. It's a bit niche, but for some it sparks joy. Number 4, Which Breed? For this we have to go for Neil Gaiman of Sandman fame's 1602 Marvel Comics contribution. It is also an alternate universe story. In this universe, the Marvel universe is all happening by in Elizabethan times, 1602. Their mutants exist, but they are known as Witch Breed. This is because they are thought to be the spawn of demons or witches. Or both. They are creatures to be hunted down, but they find safe haven in Xavier's select college for sons of gentlefolk, a school that causes great concern for Sir Nicholas Fury because he sees the potential of all these students as soldiers, which, let's not lie, that's part of what Xavier is doing. Again, this is a universe where people tend to like the whole thing, but the X-Men stand out as a distinct part, or rather, the Witch Breed. Number 3, X-Babies. Versions of your favorite characters as babies or kids. This is a concept that is either really fun or incredibly lame, depending upon who you're talking to. So the X-Babies are clones created by Mojo in the Mojoverse. This was probably inspired by an even earlier story where he had just taken the X-Men and turned them into kids, again for entertainment. Because you know, if anything goes on long enough, be it show, series, whatever, you're gonna get two things. You're gonna get a child episode, and you're gonna get a musical episode. Now, the X-Babies are a concept that is short-lived, but they are usually returned to. There is even an A-Babies versus X-Babies. Again, how cool you'll find these tots depends upon your tolerance for baby-related shenanigans. Number 2, Earth X. The version of the X-Men here are depressing, but all of Earth X is depressing, actually. After an experiment of Reed Richards goes wrong, or seemingly that's what happened, for once it's not Reed's fault, I know, shock and awe, a population of superpowered beings is produced all over the Earth, and the world drastically alters. To quote The Incredibles, when everyone's super, no one is. Suddenly, there's not as much of a reason to hate and fear the X-Men, and they've largely fallen apart. The one character people tend to remember the most that sticks out when they first think of this is Wolverine, who's got a beer gut and is married to Jean Grey, except it's not Jean, it's Madeline Pryor, but he keeps calling her Jean, and it's just sad. Now, how exactly is this cooler, you may be asking? Well, it's all in the depiction. It's unique, it's memorable, and part of a well-received work. So for many, that's what makes it cool. And finally, in at number 1, Vampire Wolverine. Wolverine, Lord of the Vampires. If you thought people loved Vampire Storm, then you know that they enjoy Vampire Wolverine. Wolverine has been a vampire more than once. You have what-if stories like the aforementioned Wolverine, Lord of the Vampires. But you also have arcs like Curse of the Mutants, which would also be the arc that left Jubilee as a vampire for a bit. Many have fond memories of the what-if story, where upon successfully turning Storm, Dracula then turns all the rest of the X-Men. Only because of Wolverine's healing factor, he figures out how to use his powers way faster than everybody else, and so he dethrones Dracula and takes over as leader of the vampires. In fact, he leads the new vampire X-Men to take over New York. It's up to the bizarre combination of Doctor Strange and the Punisher to take him down.
Number 10. Troll. The series Youngblood from Image Comics is definitely trolling us with this one. Youngblood is a series about a government-run and endorsed team of superheroes. It explores the idea of a world where superheroes garner celebrity-like status, similar to the series The Boys and Ecstatics. The team even includes Vogue, a Russian model who later uses her fame to create a makeup line. Troll is a member who is beast-like in appearance, covered in muscles. Upon seeing him in his true form, one would immediately be forced to call to mind Beast from Marvel's X-Men crew. Because get this, Troll normally is covered in blue fur. Yeah. Though admittedly, he is often seen without it as he shaves his entire body to appear more human. As his name suggests, an actual troll. While also agile and physically strong like Beast, he does not appear to hold the same level of intelligence. Though he once wielded a terrifying weapon, a book that could be used to rewrite one's own history and can tell the future, he lost it in a card game. Wah wah. Someone smaller but just as fierce as the Beast, but with less intellect, sounds pretty scary and dangerous to me. Number 9. House of X and Powers of X. These two new comic series retcon and relaunch X-Men history, and although they operate within the world of Marvel and the world of X-Men themselves, I feel as though they are important to mention. When we talk about comics inspiring people, it is important that we also recognize some of those who were inspired are fortunate enough to do the writing and illustration within the realm of the world that inspired them. How cool is that? When we turn to these new Marvel series, we see at the writing helm Jonathan Hickman, who has brought us a much more daring story when it comes to the familiar motley crew that is the mutant heroes. In fact, he has even reintroduced some heroes that we may have forgotten. The time in which mutants fight for their rights, freedoms, and even for isolation on Krakoa is painted as much more desperate and bleak. Part of this is the beautiful artwork and colors created in combination by R.B. Silva, Pepe Larraz, and Marta Gracia. The writing builds up the high stakes, and if you want to feel that tension and see how ruthless these mutants can get, check out House of X's issue number 2. Number 8. Steeljack. Astro City has changed publishers so many times, I'd rather not list them all. Instead, I'll just say the series is currently listed as belonging to Vertigo Comics. More of a concrete jungle vibe, in this series we have different factions or gangs of heroes in the city. The most similar one to the X-Men being the Astro City Irregulars. Among the characters of the series we find Steeljack, a wannabe superhero who acquired the power of metal skin. Sound familiar? Steeljack is like a permanent metal version of Colossus. Originally, this character was actually a villain in the series. I don't know about you, but I would not want to deal with a villainous version of Colossus in any form. Number 7. Sarah Rainmaker. Coming to us from Wildstorm Comics, now owned by DC, is a Storm-inspired hero. Let's spread some of that Storm love. In the Gen 13 series, Sarah Rainmaker is introduced as one of a group of Gen active teens, think mutants, who are invited to participate in government testing. The group is kept in a prison-like testing facility before they escape. Sounds like some creepy X-Men gone wrong scenario where they get successfully rounded up by the government. Sarah Rainmaker's abilities allow her to control weather, only so far as air and water, though she can also fly and create lightning. So we're looking at a character who isn't quite on Storm's power level, but definitely has similar abilities. Other interesting facts are that Sarah Rainmaker identifies as a lesbian, and that her character was originally introduced as a member of the Native American Apache tribe. Number 6. Allison Hargreaves. Coming to us from Dark Horse's Umbrella Academy comic series, which now also has a Netflix show, we have Allison Hargreaves, also known as the Rumor. This story is definitely a much stranger and darker one than X-Men, in terms of the moods and vibes, and was written and created by Gerard Way, lead singer of My Chemical Romance. This connection is a little more loose than some of the others, especially if we are looking for a huge correlation in appearance. However, when it comes to powers and personality, the connection is a strong one, as Allison resembles that of another famed X-Men and Avenger, and one of my favorite superheroes, Scarlet Witch. That is to say, Allison's powers are that she can alter reality, not using chaos magic per se, but by using the phrase, "I heard a rumor." Anything spoken after those words by her that is untrue ultimately becomes true. Scarlet Witch has also famously spoken aloud some of her changes to reality, only to have them come true, though her wishes are not as connected to the need to speak as Allison's are. Beyond that, Allison is also prone to fits of hysteria and emotional outbursts, echoing that of Wanda's struggle with her emotions and her mental health. Number 5. Toyo Harada. One could compare Toyo Harada of Valiant Comics' Harbinger series to Professor Charles Xavier, save that he is evil. Toyo is one of the most powerful psionics in the world. Again, psionics are kinda like mutants. His powers echo that of Professor X, namely that he is an insanely powerful telepath who also has the ability to control minds, but who also possesses the powers of telekinesis. His goal is to recruit others with superpowers and take over the world so that he can protect it and guide humans into the next step towards their evolution. Yeah, spooky. Number 4. Ripclaw. A combination of Warpath and Wolverine, Ripclaw comes to us from Image Comics' Cyberforce team and series. His origin story resembles a horror story and echoes some of Wolverine's origins, which, let's be honest, all of Wolverine's origin story are pretty much terrifying in and of themselves. Namely, when Ripclaw's mystical Apache powers garnered him some attention from the Cyberdata Corporation, they used him to do their bidding as their agent, after brainwashing him and giving him cybernetic enhancements. Ripclaw is also a member of the Native American Apache tribe, like X-Men's Warpath, and oddly enough, also like our number 7, Sarah Rainmaker. He was granted mystic abilities by the spirits of his ancestors to take on animal-like abilities. Similar but different than Warpath's Apache shaman spirit abilities, which he used to defeat the Demon Bear. His long black hair and red accents on his outfit also leave him looking similar to Warpath. Number 3. Silver Banshee. What happens when DC maybe gets a little inspiration from Marvel's X-Men member Banshee? We get Silver Banshee, who I actually think is an even cooler character. These two characters are similar in name and abilities only though. Both have supersonic deafening abilities, though Banshee tends to operate on the lower frequency, while Silver Banshee is perceived as operating on a higher frequency, and her sonic death cry is more deadly. If she can see you and knows your name and you hear her, you are dead. Though their names are also quite similar, Silver Banshee is known for being a villain in the DC world, where Banshee, though controlled by villains before, is usually a good guy. While Banshee is also male, while Silver Banshee is female, he did have a daughter who also had similar powers, who went by the name of Siren, before taking up her father's old mantle, Banshee. Though she has never explicitly been an X-Men member, she was one of the original X-Force members. Number 2. Psyblade. Also coming to us from the Cyberforce crew, we have Psyblade, who looks very similar to X-Men's Psylocke. Although Psyblade's powers are described as being electromagnetic while Psylocke's are described as being telekinetic, the fact remains that both can use their powers to create weapons, with which they use to fight. While Psyblade is known for her electromagnetic daggers, Psylocke is more famously known for her telekinetic katana, among other weapons. And if you don't think there is some kind of crazy connection between these two heroes, then just look at them side by side. I mean, it's hard to ignore the visual similarities here. And while Psylocke's origin story is pretty frightening, I mean, so is Psyblade's, so ugh. Number 1. Lobo. Lobo actually comes to us from DC, and is stated as being created in an attempt to poke fun at violent and gritty heroes, like Wolverine. What? So there you go. One could argue that he is an even more violent rendition of Logan, as Lobo was also inspired by Marvel's Punisher. He is fond of cigars just like Wolverine and shares some abilities, namely that he is known for being super durable and possesses accelerating healing abilities. He also has a heightened sense of smell, which he often uses as a bounty hunter to help track his bounties. Oddly enough, Image and Marvel have even created parodies of him. A parody of a parody. Wow. Go figure.
And at number 10, Mutant X Storm. Mutant X Storm is a mutant vampire. She goes by the name Bloodstorm. Classic. After being captured by Dracula, who wanted her as one of his brides, Storm is turned into a vampire. She gets her revenge though, aiding the X-Men in defeating Dracula, although she felt it was only right for her to leave the team now that she was infected with vampirism. Vampirism? Vampirism. And you know, bloodlust and what have you. Kinda would be problematic if you're trying to work on a team and you just keep trying to bite your peers. Imagine that wouldn't go over well. Later on, she would cross paths with Gambit, who pleaded with her to turn him into a vampire. So she agreed and she sired him, something that he would later resent her for in the long run. Moving on to number 9, Dark Claw. Dark Claw is the amalgamation of Batman and Wolverine from the Amalgam universe. So why is he scary and not just like totally freaking awesome? Well, just look at him. Debuting back in 1966, this character was a meta-mutant detective whose origin story is a combination between the two iconic characters' own beginnings. Logan Wayne witnessed his parents' murders as a child. When he grew up, he would join the Air Force and eventually was transferred to the Weapon X program. This is where he gains his Wolverine abilities, his adamantium-laced skeleton, and a supercharged increase in strength. Deemed a failure by those conducting the Weapon X program, he ended up going back home to New Gotham City and became Dark Claw, roaming the streets as a vigilante fighting crime. And at number 8, Storm Phoenix. Coming at you from What If Volume 2 Issue 79, this alternate version of Storm is a version that had the power of the Phoenix rather than Jean Grey. The Phoenix Force possesses her after a mission in space with the X-Men. When she comes back to Earth, she ends up creating a worldwide organization to protect the environment. Seems noble, right? But you know, she takes a little too far. Instead of it just being a regular altruistic organization, Storm openly harms those opposed to her ideals, suspending them in animation up in the Earth's atmosphere, which you gotta admit is actually kind of a funny way to, you know, be like, you to somebody. Suspend you up in the air. She ends up freezing an entire community after they violate an anti-hunting agreement. Eventually Storm Phoenix is defeated thanks to Kitty Pryde phasing into her original body. But all in all, things could have escalated to much darker territory if she hadn't been stopped when she was. Moving on to number 7, the Red Queen. This alternate version of Jean Grey hails from Earth 9575. An alternate reality that's first seen in X-Men issue 5 from 1995. This Jean has been depowered thanks to previous crimes she's committed, and it's a little unclear as to whether or not she had access to the Phoenix Force in the past. Now, having been banished from her own Earth, Earth 998, she decides to reinvent herself by pretending to be a reincarnated version of Queen Madeline Pryor, her clone. From here, she embarks on a quest to become the Queen of Britain and eventually conquer the rest of the planet, and she had a plan to do it and restore her powers by finding various different iterations of Nate Grey from across the multiverse. She would essentially lure them onto her Earth, use them, drain them of their abilities until they died, and then, you know, just grab another one and use him. Eventually she tries this trick on the 616 Nate Grey, who ends up breaking free from her powers, which results in her draining all of the life force of the other Nate Greys in an attempt to defeat the 616 Nate. But eventually Nate creates a sun around her and burns her alive. And fun fact, later on in the 616 continuity, Madeline Pryor would actually begin using the alias of Red Queen. Funny enough. She's like, I'm inspired. Moving on to number 6, Age of Apocalypse Colossus. Colossus of Earth 295 from the Age of Apocalypse Earth is not only frightening, but absolutely tragic. During the Age of Apocalypse event, he was forced out of retirement for a second time. The first was after he was so severely injured that he couldn't transform back into his human form, and was only kept together by Magneto's metal manipulation. The second time though that he came out of retirement was thanks to him needing to go on a very important mission to combat Apocalypse for Magneto. He and his wife Shadowcat led a team of mutants to save Colossus' sister, Ileana, who was the only mutant left alive with reality-traveling powers. In the process of rescuing her, he and Shadowcat abandoned their team, leaving them for dead. When he later learned that the reality that Magneto was trying to save with her powers and his plan was one in which Ileana was dead, he went berserk, going on a rampage that caused the deaths of several mutants, including his own wife. He was eventually killed by Gambit as a last resort in trying to control the mutant. And at number 5, Brute from Mutant X. Beast has had a handful of scary alternate versions, but this one looks like he crawled right out of a creature feature. Here we have Hank McCoy of Earth 1298, the Mutant X Earth, who is known as Brute rather than Beast. Brute came to be thanks to a series of deadly experiments that he conducted on himself, that not only changed him into this aquatic-esque being, which allowed him to breathe underwater, but also reduced his intelligence down to the level of a child in kindergarten. He is later further mutated, gaining hooves for feet. While he may not have his smarts anymore, the character does have a berserker streak, which when unleashed can be fatal for anyone in his way, especially considering his mental temperament. He's a bit of a tragic character as well. He was falsely accused of the murders of Green Goblin and Ben Reilly, and was executed for it. And at number 4, New Sun Gambit. From Earth 9921, we have this insanely powerful and terrifying version of Gambit known as New Sun. New Sun has control of kinetic energy on a molecular level. This means he can turn any object's potential energy into kinetic energy, which in turn makes it explosive. And it's a power without much limitations. He doesn't need to make physical contact with an object to do so, and can even do it to living beings, including humans. His total kinetic control can also stop motion, and he can simulate other kinds of energy with it, manipulating whatever kinetic energy is present in order to simulate energies like infrared energy, all by molecular agitation. In addition to that, dude can transform himself into an energy wave, which allows him to travel through space and into other dimensions. Plus, he's also killed his reality's Phoenix, which is no easy feat. He dies in Gambit Volume 3, Issue 23 when he's impaled and then explodes, which also causes his world to explode in the process. And at number 3, X-Men Forever Storm. The X-Men Forever Storm is also known as Perfect Storm and resides on Earth 161. She's a clone of the original Storm who was created in order to restore the powers of heroes who are trapped on Genosha. But the clone became unstable, rapidly aged, and during an incident with the Shadow King absorbed the darker, less friendly aspects of his personality, to say the least. She ended up becoming malevolent and ambushed the X-Men team during a mission. She would then kill Wolverine and betray the team entirely, fleeing to Wakanda to seek out T'Challa's protection. T'Challa, who had previously been in a relationship with the regular Storm, believed that she was good, and saw that she was making an effort to help the people of Wakanda, changing the weather, helping the innocent, you name it. But eventually, after the two got married, Storm betrayed him too, letting Killmonger into their quarters, who killed the rest of the royal family and T'Challa, all so she could rule Wakanda. Moving on to number 2, the Age of X Cyclops. This Cyclops hails from Earth 11326, an Earth in which anti-mutant propaganda is on the rise, and anti-mutant protests eventually lead to the decimation of mutants by the US government. As you can imagine, Cyclops did not fare well in this socio-political climate. Scott operated under the name Basilisk, and after being captured by the government, his eyelids were removed in order to prevent him from having any sort of control over his optic blasts. He was then forced to wear a mask by the prison he was kept in, and was used by Alcatraz as a mutant executioner. Kinda dark. He eventually managed to escape and managed to save some of the other mutants in the process too, but he's forever haunted by the guilt of what he was forced to do, and the lives of innocent mutants that he ended. And finally, in at number 1, the Ruins Charles Xavier. I feel like anytime Professor X has an alternate that's evil, that particular Earth suffers big time because of it. This version of Charles Xavier comes from 1995's Ruins, one of the most depressing and dark alternate reality stories in the Marvel multiverse. Taking place on Earth 9591, this Charles was elected president of the US rather than creating the X-Men. He ends up becoming corrupted and set out on a political crusade against mutants, despite having Warren Worthington III as one of his security staff, although Warren kept his mutations a secret in general. Xavier creates a prison in Texas for mutants, in which mutants are deformed, experimented on, or tortured as a means of controlling their mutations, something that he states is done for their own good. Yeah, super dark. And at number 10, Elixir. Elixir, aka Josh Foley, first appeared in 2003 in New Mutants Volume 2, Issue 5. Funny enough, he was initially a member of an anti-mutant group called the Reavers, until his powers manifested and he's kicked out of the group, causing him to reluctantly join the Xavier Institute for Higher Learning after his parents also kick him out of his home. Speaking of his powers, Elixir is able to control the biological structure of any organic matter, which also includes his own body, as long as he is in proximity of his target. This means he can do things like heal others, restore and boost mutant powers, create painful and life-threatening ailments like boils, welts, and even fatal tumors, cure the legacy virus, and even cause death. He can sense when people are sick or if there are any abnormalities in their body. He can also regenerate on a cellular level and resurrect himself, meaning he is pretty much immortal. And at number 9, Vulcan. Initially introduced in 2006 in X-Men Deadly Genesis Issue 1, Vulcan, aka Gabriel Summers, is the younger brother of Cyclops and Havoc. While he's known more so for being a supervillain, the character once upon a time was part of the X-Men team. Energy is Vulcan's jam. He can psionically manipulate, transform, control, and absorb vast amounts of energy, including energy on the electromagnetic spectrum and from exotic sources, such as Cyclops' optic blasts, or even magically created energy. He can even tap into and suppress mutant energies if he'd like, and can produce light, heat, force, you name it. This also allows him to fly and survive in space. And at number 8, Kid Omega, aka Quentin Quire. Quentin Quire first appeared in New X-Men issue 134 back in 2003. Joining the Xavier Institute. He quickly became one of Xavier's most favored students, with the professor attempting to help him control his powers. But Quentin takes a bit of a turn for the worse when he decides to start up the Omega Gang, a group of teenage mutants whose goal it was to exact revenge for the death of a famous mutant fashion designer. That, and he is super depressed about a girl not liking him back and the fact that he was adopted. Dude has fragile self-esteem. Anywho, what can he do? Well, he has advanced precognitive and telepathic abilities that not only allow him to think at immense speeds, but to manipulate the minds of others, resist mind probes, and he can psychically influence a large group of people at one time. He's even created an entire universe in his mind that he calls the Construct that he can imprison people within. Minus his previous gang shenanigans, Quentin generally acts in the interest of good, having recently been featured a member of the Fresh Start iteration of the West Coast Avengers. In at 7, Magic, aka Ilyana Rasputina. Magic is the younger sister of Colossus, and first debuted in Giant Size X-Men issue 1 back in 1975. Now despite that, her character was merely a background character for the most part, and it wasn't until 8 years later that she was given a proper name in the Uncanny X-Men issue 160 in 1982, after aging 7 years in the paranormal dimension of Limbo, where she gained her mutant abilities. This includes interdimensional teleportation, magic manipulation, and the use of something called Soul Sword, which is something created by her own life force energy, a physical sword that with each use becomes more powerful. She can also manifest eldritch armor. During her time in Limbo, Magic became the sorceress supreme of that dimension, able to cast a plethora of spells using a mix of black magic and white magic, being taught the latter by an alternate universe version of Storm. She's also capable of creating powerful mind-blocking shields, keeping the likes of some of the strongest telepathic mutants out of her head, including Professor X. In at number 6, X-Man Nate Gray. Scott Summers and Jean Grey are responsible for some of the most powerful offspring in the mutant community, regardless of whether or not they actually intended to parent them. It's worth noting that Nate Gray is not Cable. Both characters are descendants of genetic material from Scott Summers and Jean Grey, but came to be in different manners, with Nate being grown in a laboratory in an alternate dimension thanks to Mr. Sinister, who used Scott and Jean's DNA to do so. Cable, on the other hand, is the son of Scott and Madeline Pryor, who is the clone of Jean Grey. Anywho, with that out of the way, let's talk about Nate. He has the ability to tap into the enormous psychic resources found in the astral plane, which allows him to manipulate matter and energy. His powers were diminished though by the Omega Machine. He's a character whose powers sometimes inflate and sometimes are taken away in the comics. He can also exist as living psychic energy, existing outside of his corporeal form. He was given his own solo series during Age of Apocalypse that briefly replaced Cable's series, and his series ended up running until 2001 as he was brought into the Earth 616 continuity, with it ending with his seemingly sacrificial death after struggling for years with being the most powerful person in a reality in which he did not belong. How tragic. Speaking of Scott and Jean's offspring, in at number 5, Rachel Summers. Rachel Summers was created by Chris Claremont and John Byrne, first appearing in the Uncanny X-Men issue 141 back in 1981. But she didn't become Rachel Summers until after her debut, thanks to retcons. Gotta love a retcon. From an alternate future, she's the daughter of Cyclops and Jean Grey, the sister of Nate Gray, and a half-sister of Cable's. And she's hella strong. Not only has she had the Phoenix Force's abilities, she's also an empath, telepathic, telekinetic, and can astral project. She has limited time manipulation abilities too, and her telekinesis abilities can remotely manipulate matter, including on a subatomic level. And at number 4, Legion, aka David Haller. Legion, also known as David Charles Haller, is the son of Professor Charles Xavier. He traveled 20 years into the past in order to kill Magneto before his father's nemesis had the chance to amass power. But before he could, he ended up killing his father instead, which caused the Age of Apocalypse timeline to occur. Legion is often depicted as an anti-hero, and is known for his severe dissociative identity disorder, which formed after his mutant powers manifested during a terrorist attack in which he ended up absorbing the mind of the terrorist leader into his own. Because of his trauma, parts of David's personality splinter, each controlling a different aspect of his powers. Speaking of powers, why is he so strong aside from his parentage? Well, he can reality warp, he can shapeshift, he can manipulate matter, and is capable of transmutation. He can manipulate energy, he's telepathic, telekinetic, he can teleport, and of course, he can time travel. But because of his severe dissociative identity disorder in later story arcs, he's often sedated or hospitalized. Reed Richards, Madison Jeffries, and Dr. Nemesis would later create something called a neutral switchboard wristband that would help him control his multiple personalities and better manage his powers. And in X-Men Legacy, he ended up erasing himself from existence altogether, but even that didn't fully work out for him. Poor Legion. And at number 3, Hope Summers. Hope Summers first appeared in X-Men issue 205 in 2007 as part of the X-Men Messiah Complex storyline. After Decimation, a story event in which Scarlet Witch used her powers to turn all of the mutants into regular depowered humans, Hope was the first mutant to be born, which starts a hunt for the character. She's saved by Cable, who names her after her adopted mother who looked after the child with him, and Summers technically being Cable's last name. Hope is a vessel of the Phoenix Force and has unspecified limits when it comes to physically manipulating and mimicking the powers of other mutants. So yeah, in the scope of things that could be super deadly later on down the line when mutant characters have been established in the MCU. Hope's mimicry abilities allow her to use those mutant powers at their utmost capacity, but because of this she is potentially incredibly dangerous to people and the environment around her due to the massive amounts of power levels that she generates. Talk about a walking bomb. And at number 2, Jean Grey. Let's be honest here, Jean Grey is 100% going to be added to the MCU. It's almost inevitable. But the chances that we'll be seeing the Phoenix Force flexing its OP-ness on the big screen are pretty slim, at least for now. If anything, since the Phoenix Force is a major part of the X-Men stories, we think that if Jean does become the Phoenix, it'll be an event that's built up over time in the MCU, similar to what was done with the Infinity Gauntlet story arc. So really, Jean's Phoenix is just too strong for the MCU right now, but who knows what the future will hold. Regardless, she is OP as hell. And finally, at number 1, Franklin Richards. Franklin Richards is the son of Mr. Fantastic Reed Richards and Invisible Woman Sue Storm. And he's one incredibly powerful kid, that's for damn sure. First introduced in 1968 in Fantastic Four Annual Issue 6, Franklin is way beyond an Omega level mutant, having vast reality manipulating powers along with psionic powers. This means he can manipulate matter and energy on a cosmic scale, project energy, is capable of telekinesis, telepathy, astral projection, and precognition. He can teleport, and these two things are great, he's immortal, and can create pocket universes. The kid can create his own damn universes. Celestials consider him to be on par with them, and his powers only increase the older he gets. So yeah, I'm sure we'd all love to see what Marvel Studios would do with a character like that. And to be fair, we're sure Franklin Richards is far from being up on the silver screen. The MCU still needs to establish his parents first. And some people have theorized that that won't happen until after Phase 5, so long way to go, friends. Long way to go.
In at number 10, M. Monet St. Croix was born in Sarajevo, Bosnia, and was the second daughter of a very wealthy French aristocrat. She grew up as a typical spoiled rich girl until a series of extremely unfortunate events took hold of her. First, her mother died mysteriously, just out of the blue. Then, her brother Marius turned out to be a mutant who practiced black magic and transformed her into a mute red-skinned creature called Penance. And then, she was banished to another dimension with no real way home. Oh yeah, this also happened over the course of a few days. So fast forward a little bit through crazy 90s X-Men storytelling, and Monet is back on Earth, no longer a red-skinned creature, and her mutant powers have fully manifested. What are these powers, you may ask? Well, superhuman strength, speed, agility, dexterity, reflexes, coordination, balance, vision, hearing, endurance, a genius level intellect, accelerated healing factor, supersonic flight, telekinesis, telepathy, and the ability to see mutant auras. This whole thing just kind of feels like the writers couldn't agree on one specific power, so instead of just picking one, they just threw them all on the desk and picked all of them. She was a member of Magneto's Uncanny X-Men from 2016 to 2017, which was essentially a mutant Black Ops hit squad. A perfect place for this jack of all trades. And at number 9, Age of Apocalypse Magneto. Let's get this out of the way immediately. Age of Apocalypse is weird, really weird. For some reason, it's regarded as one of the best alternate timeline stories ever, but have you ever actually read the entire run? Because I did, and it's 90s as and that's not a good thing. But one of the best things to come out of this alternate timeline story is Eric Lehnsherr, aka Magneto, aka founder and leader of the X-Men. Yeah, that's right. Let me explain how we got here. So do you remember Legion from part 1 of this list? Well, one time, he decided it would be a great idea to go back in time and murder Magneto in order to get rid of the X-Men's greatest foe before he even became a threat. Things didn't really go to plan because Legion ended up killing his dad, Xavier, and erased himself along with his entire timeline from history. See? 90s as f***. In a world without Professor X, Apocalypse rose to power, and Magneto had to create his own X-Men to oppose him. Years of living as a rebel and constantly on the run from Apocalypse's armies molded this Magneto into one of the biggest badasses Marvel has ever seen. He eventually takes on Apocalypse in a one-on-one duel to the death, and rips Apocalypse in half using the iron in Apocalypse's blood. 90s as f***. And at number 8, Polaris. Lorna Dane is the daughter of Magneto, and with great power comes great magnetism. Much like her father, Polaris has the power of electromagnetic manipulation, and is just as powerful as her dad in many regards, but one moment in particular made her one of the most OP mutants of all time. During the Last Days part of the 2015 Secret Wars storyline, the Ultimate Universe's Earth was on a collision course with the 616 Universe's Earth. If they collided, both would be destroyed, killing all life on both universes. So it was up to Polaris and Magneto to team up and use their powers to hold both Earths apart from one another while fighting Sentinels. If this version of Polaris shows up in the MCU, like, who can stop her? And at number 7, Namor. The King of Atlantis is in fact not just a merman, but he's also a mutant. The first mutant in fact, if you want to believe the title of his 2010 solo run. Namor, the Submariner, is an Atlantean human mutant hybrid, and has all the powers of an Atlantean. Aquatic adaptation, hydrokinesis, telepathic control over marine life, but he also has his mutant abilities of super speed, strength, flight, agility, and mild invulnerability. And the cherry on top, his lifespan is far longer than that of regular humans, and has been in the prime of his life for like the last 100 years or so. With all these things combined, Namor has been a force to be reckoned with in Marvel Comics since his inception, and has gone toe to toe with some of Marvel's biggest villains, and lived to tell the tale. There was also that one time where he joined Thanos' cabal, murdered countless heroes from alternate Earths with his bare hands, but he doesn't really like to talk about that. And at 6, Ava Bell. Ava Bell, aka Tempest, was one of Cyclops' X-Men revolutionaries during a time in comics where nobody really knew what they wanted to do with the X-Men. Was Cyclops a good guy? Was he the new Magneto? Nobody knew. It was weird, but what wasn't weird was how awesome Tempest was. Tempest is able to manipulate time within bubbles. She could just make them out of thin air. In short, she can create a time bubble, and then time within said bubble can be manipulated at her command. Everything outside the bubble moves normally, while everything inside the bubble can be slowed down to a standstill for exactly 60 seconds. Once, under extreme stress, she time traveled to the year 2099, trained with the Sorcerer Supreme, and then came back to the current timeline with a far greater understanding of her powers. Her powers are pretty ridiculous if you ask me. And at number 5, Cable. Many of you pointed out that the last list was essentially a Summers family reunion, which you weren't wrong, but there was one really important Summers boy missing, and that was Cable. Nathan Summers is one of the most powerful mutants in existence when left unchecked. He's the biological son of Cyclops and Madeline Pryor, a clone of Jean Grey. If you've seen Deadpool 2, then you've only gotten a small glimpse of what Cable is actually capable of. Cable's powers are telepathy and telekinesis, but they're severely handicapped by his techno-organic virus in his body. He has to use the majority of his awesome power just to keep it contained to one side of his body. If he didn't do this, he'd die. However, there was one time in particular where Cable was able to cut loose and use all his power. In the series Cable and Deadpool, Cable once held an entire island in the air with one hand, fought the X-Men and the Silver Surfer with his other hand. I like to see Josh Brolin pull that one off in Deadpool 3. And at number 4, Triage. Christopher Muse is another of Cyclops' aforementioned X-Men revolutionaries, and his powers are pretty ridiculous. In short, he can heal people just by touching them. Well, seems simple enough, right? Well, it gets a little more complicated the more you look into what he's doing over time. Initially, Triage is only able to heal things like broken bones, cuts, bruises. However, later on in the comics, he becomes so powerful that he can actually bring the recently deceased back to life. He even managed to bring himself back to life after being stabbed in the neck by Wolverine and Mystique's alternate universe son. Yeah, that was a thing that happened. And at number 3, Matthew Malloy. This guy had a very brief appearance in the comics, but oh, what an appearance. Matthew Malloy witnessed the death of his wife during the Skrull invasion of Earth, and was left horribly traumatized by the event, as anyone would. Years later, he met up with his former sister-in-law, and this reminder of his former life was the breaking point for his psyche. His mutant powers emerged and vaporized everything around him, including said former sister-in-law. S.H.I.E.L.D. shows up to detain him, he blows up S.H.I.E.L.D. X-Men shows up to talk him down, they get blown up, and Matthew rewrites the laws of physics and reassembles himself. When he goes to the X-Mansion to ask for help, he accidentally kills more X-Men. The only way they were able to stop this guy was by going back in time and preventing his parents from ever meeting. If that's not powerful, I don't know what is. And at number 2, Colossus Juggernaut. Okay, I know what you're thinking. How can Colossus Juggernaut be higher on this list than Matthew Malloy, a man who can literally bend space and time to his will? Well, in short, it's my list, and I want to talk about Colossus Juggernaut at number 2. Let me know down in the comments if you've ever used your own great power to manipulate things to your own benefit. Anyways, Peter Rasputin is a giant, metal Russian man who punches things until they stop moving. The Juggernaut is an unstoppable avatar of the interdimensional demon Sidorak, a giant mammoth of a man who cannot be stopped once he starts building momentum. What happens when you combine these two things together? You get Colossus Juggernaut, one of the coolest amalgams ever created by Marvel. Oh yeah, and he's canon. Suck it, Iron Hammer. Anyways, this guy's power level far exceeds that of 9,000, and he once fought against the previous Juggernaut, Cain Marko, after having his skull split in half. Metal. And in at number 1, Old Man Phoenix. Jason Aaron's run on Thor might be the greatest Thor story ever told. If you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend you get to it ASAP. It's amazing. He covers pre-worthy Thor from mythology, lovable current day Thor, god of thunder, and a future version of Thor where he's become the Allfather and basically Odin with a hammer. In the old Thor universe, we follow Thor as he flies through a dying universe trying to find a way to save it. Who does he run into? Well, Wolverine, the last mutant in existence, and he's possessed by the Phoenix Force. Think about it. Logan's healing factor, upgraded by all the power of the entire Phoenix Force. He is so powerful, he was burnt into a skeleton and still kept fighting. The only reason he died was because he fused himself into Mjolnir to give his powers to Thor. Absolute unit.